Welcome, class, to the Week 4 presentation for ME 150. This week we are focusing on Chapter 5, which centers around professional liability and medical malpractice. Some heavy hitters that we definitely need to know about. So be sure to read through Chapter 5 in your textbook to help you prepare for this week as well. Let's start with liability, and it's important to know what that means. A simple definition for you to remember is the legal responsibility of competent adults for their own actions, because we are indeed responsible for what we say and do. In terms of a physician's liability as an employer, so let's talk about that. They have some extra things to look out for as an employer. And honestly, these things go for any employer, whether it be a physician or any other business as well. Grounds and buildings, they have to be adequately upkept. Automobiles, this one can be a little confusing. If an employee is using their personal automobile in the performance of their daily work, then they would be responsible for reimbursement for that. This does not apply to driving to and from work from your house, so please keep that in mind. Employee safety. Reasonably comfortable and safe work environment is what we're striving for there. Next, we're going to talk about standard and duty of care. Let's start with standard of care. And your quiz does ask a couple questions on these two things, so please make sure you know and understand them. Standard of care is a level of performance expected of healthcare workers carrying out duties. An example: a medical assistant takes universal precautions while drawing blood for an analysis. That is considered a standard of care that you would perform universal precautions. This slide and the next slide are also important for your discussion this week, so please use these two slides in helping you prepare for that as well. Duty of care. So this is obligations of healthcare workers to patients and non-patients. Let's talk about some examples there. A doctor working in an ER is obligated to treat all patients who come through the door. That would be a duty of care. Now, the level of which they perform those expectations, that would go to standard of care. Another example of duty of care. A doctor working in a nursing home warns the residents of an outbreak of a communicable disease and takes measures to protect them from exposure. That would be a duty of care. Let's focus just for a second on negligence. And I know we talked about that last week, but it also comes up this week in your quiz as well. An example: if a patient is injured because a healthcare professional failed to exercise the care and expertise that under the circumstances could reasonably be expected of a professional with similar experience and training, then that professional may be liable for negligence. Next, we're going to talk about reasonable person standard. Okay, so this is the standard of behavior that judges a person's actions in a situation according to what a reasonable person would do or not do in a same circumstance. So it would have to be an identical circumstance and what is considered reasonable for the average person, basically. Let's talk about some guidelines for healthcare practice. Some of these may seem like no-brainers to you, but I think we can all use a brush up on guidelines. So I will tell you your quiz has some examples of these, and I think you probably all are familiar with these, but if not, you might want to brush up on these. Practice within the scope of training. That means that whatever you are certified to do, that's what you would do and not necessarily something a physician would be certified to do. There is a standard scope of care, and that scope of care does include some things, that physicians might have in their scope of care, but it may not be in yours. So you kind of have to limit to what is considered reasonable for your profession. Use professional title commensurator with experience and education, meaning you can't fake and use a title that you did not earn. Maintain confidentiality. That, of course, means not releasing patient information to unauthorized individuals, along with many other things. Prepare and maintain health records. Document accurately. Use appropriate ethical and legal guidelines for patient information. And then this continues on our next slide with follow employers' established policy. So when you start a new job, you should ask for their policy and procedures manual so that you do indeed know what their established policies are. Follow appropriate legal guidelines, of course. Maintain and dispose of controlled substances properly. Follow risk management protocols. Meet requirements for credentialing. That's always important. You work hard to get your credentials. You have to make sure you understand how to keep them. Help maintain and develop policies. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about confidentiality. Just as a reminder of what that means, it's the act of holding information in confidence, not to be released to unauthorized individuals, and hopefully we're all aware of that meaning. Within the scope of healthcare, you are subjected to privileged communications. That's information held confidential within a protected relationship. So that's information that should not be shared unless it's pertinent to the patient's healthcare and they have indeed, formed a relationship with that healthcare provider that they do indeed need to know that information. An example of a type of privileged communication is a patient tells her doctor that she uses illegal drugs. That is going to be important for her health care, and it is something that physician cannot share with outside parties. A side note, because often this is a point of confusion involving confidentiality, when an office clerk or a receptionist calls out patients' names at the checkout desk, that is not considered a violation of patient confidentiality. So that's an important side note to kind of remember, and I think your quiz does touch on that as well. So let's talk about ways to maintain confidentiality next. Always obtain signed consents, whether it be to communicate something to another individual or for a procedure that's coming up or to release records. Avoid judgments about patients' morals. I always tell people to check your personal beliefs at the door. You are there to help the patients that come through the door. Despite how you would want to be treated, we have to treat them as they want to be treated. Financial information is also confidential, so please remember that. While on the phone, do not use patient's name if others are around. Use caution when leaving messages on voicemail. And I always tell people, look and make sure you have consent to leave a message on a voicemail before doing so, and to what extent you can leave the information in the message. Keep patient information out of sight from other patients and visitors. Make only legal exceptions to disclosure. If you are ever making an exception to disclosure, I would make sure that you run that through the office manager and the physician that you work for before doing so that you can make sure everyone's in agreement that it is a legal exception. We touched last week on unintentional tort of negligence. So let's bring this back to the forefront again. It's any deviation from the accepted medical standard of care causing injury to the patient. So it has to be a deviation from the standard, and it has to cause injury to the patient to be considered negligence. This is a basis for professional malpractice claims, so it is something that a malpractice claim could be filed for. And it's the most common liability in medicine, so it is something to take very seriously. We're going to talk next about some other professional liability claims. These terms are important to know for your quiz, as well as I believe there's more on the next slide. Let me do a little preview. Nope, these three. Malfeasance. This is performance of a totally wrong and unlawful act. Misfeasance is performance of a lawful act in an illegal or improper manner. So you can see the difference there. Nonfeasance is a failure to act when one should have. Those, if they're new terms to you, you might make flashcards of those. That would be helpful. 4 elements to prove negligence. So if you are trying to bring a case against someone for negligence, there's 4 elements that you have to prove in order for negligence to fly. The first element is duty. That's the person charged owed a duty of care to the accuser. The second is dereliction. The healthcare provider breached the duty of care to the patient. I will tell you your quiz does focus on those two, duty and dereliction, so make sure you know those. Direct cause. The breach of duty of care to the patient caused injury. Remember, we talked about how negligence has to involve an injury. Damages. There is a legally recognizable injury to the patient. Another term that you need to be familiar with, if my slide will change here, there it goes. Res ipsa loquitur. When translated, it means the thing speaks for itself. What that means to us in common language is the negligence is obvious, meaning this is a no-brainer. An example of that would be a surgeon removes the wrong kidney from a patient. That's obviously some negligence occurred there. So 3 conditions must occur for this. The act must be under the defendant's control. The patient must not have contributed to the act. And it must be apparent that the patient would not have been harmed if reasonable care were used. So some important things that have to be looked at there. Some cases other than the kidney example I gave you. Leaving foreign bodies or objects in the patient's body during surgery. So if the physician forgets to remove something. Accidentally burning or injuring a patient while he or she is anesthetized. So while they're under anesthesia, if they're accidentally burned or injured. Damaging healthy tissue during surgery. Causing an infection by using unsterilized instruments. You can see these are all things that are very obvious of wrongdoing, so they fall under that category. When we were talking about damage awards, there's different types, and I want you to focus on 3 of these specifically. General compensatory. That's to compensate for injuries or loss due to a violation of patient rights. And let's talk about an example there. A patient's mammogram was read as normal. 6 months later, the patient finds a lump in her breast, and the patient has a lumpectomy to make a full recovery. It was determined that the mass was present and visible in the original mammogram. So the patient sued, claiming mental anguish. She would seek general compensatory damages. Okay. I also want you to focus on consequential. So I'm skipping over one and going to consequential. That's to compensate for losses caused indirectly by a product defect. So an example, a patient was harmed when the oxygen tank she was using exploded. She would seek consequential damages. The other one I want you to focus on is punitive. That's to punish the offender. So that's damages awarded by the court to punish the defendant, and those are called punitive damages. Before we wrap up our time today, there's actually 2 tidbits, and I didn't make slides for them because they didn't fit real nicely with anything else, but I do want to make sure that I focus on these 2 because they do fall on your quiz. According to the Physicians Weekly, which is a magazine or a publication, and it's from a chart in your book, the medical specialty most likely to be sued is internal medicine. And I believe that statistic came from 2013. The other tidbit I want to make sure that you know, and this is an example, and it has to go with damage awards. The family of a patient sues for wrongful death when the patient's death was judged to have been due to negligence of the healthcare practitioners. The family in this case is hoping to collect an award for the loss to the patient's estate for future earnings. So that is something that can be done, is collecting a loss for future earnings from a a deceased patient. As always, if you have additional questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me at any time. And all of our information discussed today did come from your textbook for our class. So be sure to read your chapter, make sure you get your work in on time, all of those fun things. Again, the recommended reading for this week was Chapter 5. Also, just one heads up on your assignment before we go. You do have the end of chapter review questions to turn in, but then you also, for your research paper that will be due later in the class, you do need to submit a rough draft. So please remember that is a portion of your assignment this week. Thank you so much and have a great week.